Hello, my name is Steve D'Agostino, and in this video I'd like to share with you the adapted fishbowl that my co-facilitator Ann Fernald and I attempted in a Zoom session attended by over 200 Fordham faculty, instructors, and administrators as part of a flexible hybrid course that we've been offering throughout the summer. So what is a fishbowl? Fishbowl is a discussion strategy that focuses on both student-centeredness and listening skills. In a face-to-face classroom, you'd arrange the students in a small group in the center of an outer ring of students, and students in the center would have a discussion, and the students in the outer ring would observe. Then you would rotate students in and out of the different roles of participant and observer during the fishbowl, and you would act as the facilitator. Ann and I wanted to see if the fishbowl technique would work in Zoom. So this video will show an excerpt from part of that fishbowl discussion. In preparation, the day prior, participants were invited to be part of the fishbowl to give them a chance to prepare or decline. We asked a provocative question about using remote proctoring during exams online, and it didn't have a correct answer, but we wanted a question that was really timely and relevant and that had many different perspectives. Participants were not tapped in and out the way you might do in a physical classroom, obviously, but they were called upon. Some of the hoped-for outcomes are, by making participation exclusive, we thought that others would want to participate. And actually that turned out to be the case because there was a lot of activity in the chat, and there were like hundreds of raised hands because this is a really large group. We wanted to model what a discussion in Zoom could look like because it has been sort of problematic for a lot of faculty and instructors to figure out, how do I manage this sort of weird environment I'm not used to teaching in? Also, a problem with Zoom is class size numbers. Everyone doesn't appear on the same screen. So Fishbowl can make a big class small in the sense that you're highlighting on members of the class community and students are moving in and out of that discussion. And if you use the settings to display the speaker, then students would really be able to see or hear each other's voices in a much more featured way. So a follow-up to Zoom could be, students can do a few writing activities. I wish I would have said, if I were a participant in the fishbowl, I would have. Something I learned from this discussion is, I've done a separate video about the fishbowl technique, and it goes through a number of activities that you might want to try, both before and after a fishbowl. So fishbowls is a way to use student discussion as an object of analysis that can be returned to and reflected upon. Why did we have this discussion? What did we do? What does an effective discussion look like? Like any activity that you do in your class, there are modifications. We left the chat feature on, so there's a lot of activity in the chat. With a group of over 200 Zoom attendees, that seemed a better approach. It would be interesting to turn the chat off during the fishbowl to channel energy toward the discussion and not have two discussions kind of happening simultaneously. So like with any activity you do in your class, there are modifications. Ann and I left the chat feature on, so there was a lot of activity in the chat. With a group of over 200 attendees in this particular Zoom, that seemed a better approach. It would be interesting to turn the chat off during the fishbowl to channel energy toward the discussion so there aren't two discussion channels, or perhaps to use the chat feature in a more purposeful way by having students focus on particular points, or by having them keep a running record of what they're noticing, or by trying to determine, well, what are good and effective discussion strategies? We controlled the fishbowl, but with a smaller class group, students can be assigned an order and a discussion duration. So every member gets some amount of minutes in the fishbowl, and the founding members are rotated out one by one. The next section of the video shares an excerpt from our discussion.
I want to pivot to what I want to have be the kind of center of our conversation today, and that is a fishbowl conversation, which is a technique for synchronous engagement. It may be helpful for us this is an uncommonly large group of people, right? And so a lot of the things that you may find, just want to remind you, a lot of the things that may seem overwhelming in terms of the volume of feedback are due both to the fact that we've overcorrected for everyone in this room is a teacher, so everyone in this room is a kind of master participator, and there are 200 of us, right? And so it's kind of doubling that. But I want to introduce a kind of fishbowl conversation. And again, as with everything else we've been doing, there's content to the conversation that I want you to be attending to, and kind of meta commentary about how a kind of fishbowl model for discussion might work for you in your classroom that I want you to be attending to. So in a minute, Steve is going to kind of orally describe a little bit more details about this case that I mentioned in my email to you earlier today. Only a few people are going to talk. I've kind of called on them ahead of time so they know who they are. And I've tried to choreograph the participants to be a kind of faculty members from a range of fields with special attention to disciplines where there's a kind of open game model of learning, right? Where there's a real premium on multiple right answers, lots of room for interpretation, and a more closed game model of learning where part of what you need to learn is what is correct and what might be incorrect in following through a content. So I'm going to invite some faculty members into the conversation, and kind of after about 3 or 4 minutes, I'm going to add someone new into the conversation. So we're going to start with Usha Sankar and Francesca Parmigiani, and I'm going to unmute them. And then after Usha and I'm going to have Steve describe the case. I'm going to unmute Francesca and Usha. And then after a couple minutes, I'm going to add someone else. Okay. And we'll just keep adding. Your job as a participant is to listen and reflect on what you're hearing about the case itself. Okay. So just listen to the case. Think about how you would answer it if you were called on to talk. And then the meta task is to use the fishbowl experience to reflect on classroom discussion. What does discussion do in your classroom? How do you want to use discussion in your classroom? When is it important for you to have synchronous live discussion on a platform like Zoom? And when might something like a discussion board or voice thread or perusal serve some of the functions of discussion in the classroom? Okay, I'm going to put the charge to the participants in the chat in just a second. But really what I want you to focus on is Steve's case. Okay, so Steve, lay it on us.
Okay. I thought you were going to say like action or something.
Oh,
so
there you go.
about 2 or 3 days ago, my stepson wanted to talk with me about something that happened when he applied to take a summer course. I wasn't able to talk to him then because he didn't, have an appointment to Zoom with me, but we ultimately got together through Zoom. And what happened was he registered for a summer computer science course where he goes to school. He's a freshman at Penn, and he's a course behind. So he registered for the course and then got an email, as did all his classmates, with a statement that if they wanted to stay in the course, they needed to agree to use ProctorU. He didn't know what ProctorU was, and there was a little paragraph explaining it. So he and his classmates did some research about ProctorU, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's a live proctoring solution that essentially would have someone watching you through your webcam and listening to you through your camera. They would have access to your computer remotely and lock down your browser while you took this exam to make sure you weren't cheating. So he was really upset about this, and his classmates wrote a whole article. They did some research about some of the technology and personal privacy implications and sent it to their professor. They haven't heard back yet. This was just yesterday. But we talked for a while last night about whether or not he should drop the class. So this is sort of the case that we'd like you guys to sort of think about in our fishbowl activity.
So Usha and Francesca, what would you advise Steve's stepson to do?
So this is something that I've been thinking about a lot. Just this past semester, this is I have gotten emails from services that would that offer to do this for my course from the same publisher that published the textbook that my students are using. So this is definitely something I've been thinking about, but I have not accepted the offer from the publisher because I had reservations on my own about invasion of privacy and things like that. And sometimes it's, even I don't always have my video camera on at all times. And that could be sometimes because of bandwidth issues, sometimes because I don't want it on. So this is kind of forcing the students to do it. So it is kind of something that I have been thinking about, but haven't really made up. It sounds very invasion of privacy kind of thing. And so it's easy to say, no, don't use it. But then on the other hand, when I see my grades, I see that my grades before and after the online exams, between before and after pandemic, they have actually been higher a lot. So I can see that there is definitely something that changed, right, between in-class and online exams. But so this semester I didn't do it. I don't think I'll do it in the future either, but it's definitely, I can understand why a university or professors would be willing to consider an option like this. Then they're not, the onus is not on the instructor to proctor the students, but it's actually up to the students to, But then I've also heard stories where something happened or their eyes moved away from the screen for a second or something happened, and then somebody got caught saying that, oh my God, you strayed, you're not looking at the camera, so you must be looking at your phone or something like that. And so it can lead to a lot of issues. The answer is...
Yeah, Francesca, what do you think? That's a lot. I'm sorry.
There are a lot of things that Asha said that I'm in agreement with. In other words, there are serious risks, and it is a real issue. But I find the system extremely intrusive. I think that there are two issues here: is really what the institution wants to do, because that seems actually a choice at the institutional level. And what in fact we should be doing as an institution and faculty members in order to ensure that our students are aware of what it means really to act in an academically accepted way, and foster an ethos, a habit of honesty. And I understand that. I think that my takeaway from this, certainly if I were to respond to the question, what I would advise Steve Stepson to do, I personally would say drop the class. I find it I actually commend your Stepson in doing some research and really become very, very conscious about the potential intrusiveness in monitoring student production. Although I don't want to take away from the need that there has to be some monitoring. But at the same time, I also think this is extremely intrusive, and it really launches this message to the student that they're not trustworthy, and we do not consider them responsible citizen of an academic community. And so I must say, I know that in other institutions, they do have these services, but I do hope this is not going to be for them choice. Nevertheless, I do believe that my sense is that this is at least the position of the faculty members sometimes, but I think also of students. It's easier online to get away with cheating, plagiarism. And so the real question is, how can we address that pragmatically in our courses? Also considering what you pointed out and the differences of the discipline, and therefore also the type of production the students can offer.
So I just want to respond with just 2 points. One is that sometimes the students don't have an option. My niece goes to Rutgers and she just had to agree. There was no option. She's a freshman. She had to take all her exams using responders. Mm-hmm. And either she could drop the freshman courses, in which case she wouldn't have a GPA, or to move on, she had no option. She just had to do, it was a university-wide thing. And the other thing is that, yes, I do start each of my exams on top, even though it's an online exam. I remind my students that, yes, you all take the academic integrity tutorial as freshmen when you join Fordham and all of that. So that is right. That is something that I remind them. But you are right. Online, it is very easy to access, right? You can even have a textbook next to you. You don't, you know, right? You can, or you could just Google it. It's just that much, so much easier.
I want to bring Giacomo Santangelo into the
Yeah.
conversation, but Francesca, you wanted to say something, so I don't know if
Yes,
Giacomo or
I
Francesca.
would like to. I would be very curious to hear from also from Giacomo, who has just joined the conversation. Really, what do we do, or what do you do in your discipline in order to address this particular instance? And please, what did you do this past semester, or in other, you know, online occurrences even prior to this semester?
Well, first of all, I think it was Francesca who said that this sends a message, and it is a signal that the students are not trustworthy, that in an academic environment. And I have to say, students are not trustworthy in an academic environment. Students cheat when we're in the room with them. So to assume that they're not going to attempt to cheat when they're at home in a room with their books and their notes and the internet, I think it's naive to think that they're not going to cheat. And I'm not saying that our students are all cheats. I'm just saying that the temptation is so great that the assumption is someone has to watch them. Now, if this is a question of whether or not ProctorU or lockdown or one of these things is the best tool, I can't say that. Is it a question of, is it invasive? Of course. But if you are a faculty member who during an exam gets up and walks up and down the aisles or walks by, that's invasive. You're invading their space. You're literally standing up and looking around the room to see, is anyone cheating? You're not doing that because you're stretching your neck. You're doing that to ensure you're trying to keep them honest. And I think in this current situation, we need something to keep the students honest. And there are other tools, and again, we could get lost in the weeds of talking about which one's better. There's a tool that literally just locks your screen. It's called Lockdown, I think. It literally just locks your screen on the test, so they can't go to something else. They can't go somewhere else. But again, if someone's in the room feeding them answers, if it's a section where, let's say you have, and this has happened to me last semester, I had 2 siblings in one class, so that during the exam or during classes, I would see both of them sitting there and I'm talking to both of them and they're taking notes. So when it came time for them to take the exam, I know they were both sitting in the room together on laptops, and I know they were talking to one another, and that was completely unavoidable. I think for us moving forward, we need to find some way to administer exams to limit the quantity of cheating that's going to take place. This specific, so my suggestion. Yeah, go ahead, Ann.
Yeah, sorry, Jeff. So I've added Brandy Monk.
Steve's son is, yeah.
Go ahead.
So whatever makes Steve's stepson comfortable, if he's uncomfortable with this, find a teacher that's not doing this, right? So I think that would be my suggestion. Go ahead, I'm done.
Sorry, I've added Brandy Monk Payton into the circle. I see some hands up, but I want to really, rather than calling on people, I know lots of people want to talk, but I really want to kind of play with the fishbowl a little bit more strictly before people jump in. So Brandy, I wanted to hear what you have to say about this whole conversation. What have you been hearing?
Yeah, thank you for all of your thoughts. And I should say I'm in a humanities field, film and media studies. And so the assessment tools that I normally utilize are analytical based. They're interpretive and argumentative, primarily in terms of writing. And so I rarely give in-class exams, although I definitely see that those concerns exist when you're placed in this online environment. I'm averse to that kind of monitoring software. It's invasion of privacy, it's anxiety producing. And so I guess one thing that I want to think about is, what other kinds of assessment tools can we create or utilize in order to, get the same kinds of results in terms of learning. And so, in my own teaching, I've, again, I'm fortunate I'm able to do sort of creative projects or scaffolded writing assignments, you know, other ways to not sort of be sort of stymied by the kind of in-class exam, right? Even open book sort of exams, I think, when you create, you know, the right conditions and questions to ask, are able to assess in the way that you want. One thing Usha brought up about the kind of noticing the higher grades. And so that actually is a challenge for me, and particularly during this last semester, knowing that we're in a global pandemic, right? How do you assess distinctions across students in terms of grading and, you know, being more flexible in that environment? I guess I would ask, what do grades mean now? Or how do they mean? and how do we think about that across our disciplines? So
I think that's a valid question, but you bring up the point that, for example, the introductory statistics class, am I supposed to give them a week or 3 days to take the exam? It's a math test. I can't give them 3 days to take the test. And it has to be a test. I can't give them a perusal or a thing. There's no, you know, thing. Literally, they're going to be there if they have their textbook. If they have, you know, I can make it. I give them the formulas. They're allowed to use a calculator. But clearly, if they communicate with other people, if they use the internet, you know, how do I know what's the right formula to use? There are questions that they have to answer, and
Francesca,
that has to happen. I have to give them a test.
Yeah,
and because
I totally understand.
Built upon that. If they don't learn those basic things, then down the road they have a problem. So yeah, for you in a lot of disciplines, and I saw several of the comments where people are saying, well, you know, different disciplines are different. Absolutely. But what do we do for math? Do we just say, oh, well, you know, we'll give them a group assignment? We can't do that.
Francesca, did you want to weigh in on this?
I just want to say one thing. I do understand, but there are two issues here. And one is really the mere assessment to test whether or not the student has learned something, and basically how that translates into a grade and an evaluation. And the other thing is that what kind of work ethos are we actually trying to share and instill and teach students? And if we create a surveillance state, basically we're going to say, you do this, you get punished. And I don't think there's really any negotiation. There's no learning opportunity there. And that does not mean that we should not be proctoring, we should not make sure that these instances don't occur, etc. But I'm also thinking about the work ethos that is so core in what we are doing. And you know, for me, this is key. This is why I'm certainly not in favor of a situation like ProctorU. I don't think it really fostered that ethos of understanding and honesty that in fact is part of the liberal arts enterprise.
I'm going to add David Wright to the conversation, and he's going to be the last person I add. So David, I wonder what you have been thinking as you reflect on all of this.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I definitely see a lot of these concerns. I mean, for me, number one is the issue of anxiety. I feel like we're already in scary times, and I can only imagine how much more anxiety this would cause. That, in addition to like the ethics of surveillance. Or I'm a classicist, so I'm kind of in this weird in-between state where I teach literature, so it's very like open-ended, and like I'm very open to like giving an open book test and that. But at the same time, I teach Latin, where like, you know, you have to know the forms. But I've been thinking just any way I can not have to do a surveillance of them, even in a class that is sort of like right and wrong like Latin. I mean, I am thinking like, even as a classicist myself, I'm doing translations, but sometimes like I check the dictionary for things. So I'm sort of like, well, is it really that wrong to have them do that? Then I can just be maybe more critical, because they have an open book when they're translating things, or I can just find new ways of, okay, they can get a translation from anywhere online. Well, can I have them do something like, you have to give me a reflection on your translation, explain to me why you translated it this way. So basically what I'm thinking of is just trying to find any way not to have to do this. And I can't speak for math professors, if there's any sort of solution to that, because like Giacomo was saying, you know, in stat class, like you know the formula and that's it. But I don't know, is there any sort of room for creativity there, or room for having students maybe explain how they get to this? But you know, I realize that, you know, I don't teach something like
Should you-
That's helpful, yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking that, you know, I've been thinking about this, and this is something as I look through so much information is available right now in terms of how you're going to teach in the fall, what are you going to, and this class is a great example of how we're thinking about what we've learned this semester and how do we move forward in the fall. So one of the things I'm not seeing at all is assessment. That is a huge thing that I'm not seeing a whole lot of people talking, writing, and so that is something I've been thinking about. And my conclusion is that I'm actually completely redesigning my course with case studies. So I teach human physiology, so I teach different body systems, and every body system is going to be some disease, right? I'm going to say, you know, this person has this disease. What have you learned in this system that is going to help us diagnose, you know, or treat, or whatever it is? Like, what is the basis for this? So the end result is going to be, I'm thinking, first of all, to break down, instead of having exams, to break them down into unit tests, smaller tests that I can do in class. I've used POLEV, and I can use all those in-class questions as a low-stakes assessment. And then for actual bigger questions than that, I want them to be like, I want to give them case studies and saying, you know, and then ask them questions, right? What do you think this person has if they have these symptoms, and how do you design, you know, how do you know, you know, things like that. So that is my own personal solution to not having to proctor them, but kind of like take home exams, but not saying, you know, give me 5 pages on diabetes, right? You can get it from anywhere. But if I give you different symptoms, how do you know what this person has, and tell me how you figured that out?
Well, I think, you know, the question of what we should recommend that Steve's stepson do, I mean, if it's not required that he take this one section, if he has the option, if he's uncomfortable, then take a section with another professor. If we apply that to our situation, if there are 200 of us and 100 of us use this tool and the other 100 of us don't use this tool, because we're giving the students the opportunity, because as Francesca said, we want to foster trust, a feeling of trust. We don't want there to be anxiety, and we give students the option, because we tell them ahead of time, look, in our course objectives, I'm going to make you use this proctor. You're going to make you use this surveillance software when we take exams, because reasons. Then I think we have another problem, and that problem is that some students are going to stay away from the surveillance classes. Some students are going to be stuck because they don't have any other options because the other sections are full. So this literally becomes something that the university has to make a decision on, and that becomes a universal thing, and that's a whole nother problem.
Yeah,
right.
Francesca,
So then the student doesn't have the option, because I was saying, my niece is at Rutgers. Every course at Rutgers is going to be run through responders, so they have no option.
Yeah. I really like that idea of the sort of mini quizzes and sort of embedded. I think that sort of, you know, allows for, a kind of sense of community, but then also, you know, the way that you're talking about doing this kind of applied with case studies and having that be a kind of exam. I can see how that would definitely work within sort of STEM fields. And certainly something that I also do in the humanities, you know, if in lieu of not having, you know, an in-person exam, what if I gave them a clip of a commercial, a TV commercial, and had them analyze it according to concepts, right? So that sounds similar to what you're doing in STEM as well.
Right. All right, I'm going to pause. This was amazing, and I've been watching the chat. There's a bunch of stuff going on in the chat. I have so many different thoughts. Francesca, I want to just give you the last word, and then I want to pivot to kind of assessing the fishbowl, reflecting on what the fishbowl was like.
So,
Okay,
very quickly, I think that I was trying to keep up with the chat also, and I think it's been extremely challenging. But what I pointed out, I think there were some comments that really struck me, and I'm in perfect agreement that actually I see a consonance between part of the discussion and the chat about, for example, how do we use the assessment tools? How do we adapt our, our expectations, and also how we adapt the type of testing or for shorter quizzes, and I would like to add, for example, de-emphasize the final grade through, for example, rewriting, right? If students write a paper. So these are techniques we are already familiar with because we use them already in face-to-face instruction, but I think that could be also easily replicated in an online system. But I do have a question for Steve, perhaps a question that I should have asked at the start. And I think once again, it's something that came up in the discussion. So there is an institutional choice made, right? That could go along, that could be determined by the number. State institution with many more students, larger classrooms, more courses online. So the question for Steve is the following: does the student, basically all classes at Penn actually expect student to adapt and subscribe to this policy? Or is it instead that faculty in that particular summer course that expected student for them to take the course to subscribe to this policy? That was perhaps a question I should have asked at the very start.
That's a really good question. I don't know. I don't know what the Penn policy is actually. So I guess I can share a very short 10-second anecdote. So I taught English to speakers of other languages at my first teaching job at James Monroe High School, which is in the Soundview section of the Bronx. I was like 24 years old. I gave my first test. Some of the students were more proficient than others. So I give out the test and they all start talking to each other. So I'm like, wait, it's a test. You can't talk. So one student who he spoke some English, he said to me, but mister, I know the answer and my friend doesn't know the answer. Why can't I tell him? So I'm like, I don't know, tell him. I don't know, it's English, it's not a secret, So this was, I guess, in 1989. And it really made me rethink, like, what am I doing? Like, what is a test for? And so I'm going to pivot from that sort of mindset to think about what we just did in the fishbowl. Susan asked a really good question, like, how is this a fishbowl? What is it? So we did a couple of things with this fishbowl. The first is what's called, if you know about Reggio Emilia, maybe Francesca, you know this, it's a instructional methodology adopted from that small village. And a key component of it is something called provocation. So provocation is sort of what we just did. It's an open-ended kind of provocation to get students to engage in discussion. There is no answer. It's in a sense, and Ann and I have talked about this, the difference between a finite game and an infinite game. So some discussions are finite games, right? There's an answer, it's an argument, and you want to get to a conclusion. An infinite game, the purpose is to just make the game last as long as possible, like Dungeons and Dragons. The point is to play the game, not to win the game. So in a fishbowl, Susan asked this in the chat, what does it do? What is it for? It does a couple of things. I thought about turning the chat off, but I thought you might explode. Your heads might explode in this particular topic. But what we want to do is flip the expectation so the students want to participate, but they can't, right? So that's one thing. Why couldn't I talk? They got to talk and not me. So like it intrinsically motivates them to want to say things. But also it's helpful early on in a course to develop a common understanding about when we're having a class discussion, what are we doing, right? What is a discussion? What is the object? Are we clarifying our own thoughts? Are we sort of practicing our use of the disciplinary literacy? Are we reaching toward a preordained conclusion that me, the teacher, has in his head that I want them to get to? So Anne, I'm going to let you jump in because
No, and I think, part of what we can model for our students in something like a fishbowl. So, when you're in a classroom, you can tap someone on the shoulder or give people permission to tap people on the shoulder and move in and out. That's not going to be possible right now, right? But I could say, I'm unmuting you. And even though I saw raised blue hands from people whom I knew had something smart to say, I deliberately didn't call on them, even though I knew it would be worth our hearing, because I had a list that I had kind of choreographed ahead of time of the people whom I wanted to call on, right? And so part of it is also, and you see that Steve and I didn't talk a lot today, or much less than we usually have, and that's another piece of it, is I don't know, but I don't think Usha, Francesca, Giacomo, Brandy, and David, they're not in the same department. You guys aren't, the best. You're not. That's not a clique of friends. That's a group of people who've been really engaged in this class, in this workshop, right? And so part of it was teaching you how to talk to each other, and demanding that you do it, right? So that was a piece of it. And you can create more guidelines in a fishbowl to demand, like ask someone a question, or you can't speak until 3 other people have spoken. Everyone in the fishbowl knew I was going to call on them. They knew the order that they'd be brought into the chat. So I guess let me ask Brandy, since you came in a little bit later, what was it like for you to listen, knowing that any minute I was going to say, okay, Brandy, you're unmuted?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was trying to somewhat take notes or sort of jot down, so I did have a piece of paper next to me. And there is a kind of sense of anticipation / dread that happens only, I think, through this kind of online means, perhaps, in terms of being on, like, for example, I was just like chatting and then, so I think that we're dealing with a lot of different kind of tasks at hand. And so, yeah, trying to jump into that.
So I wanted.
If you have any questions, please email me at d'agostino@fordham.edu. Thanks very much.